Hi, welcome to Watercolours with Caroline. This week we are going to be warming up by testing out our warm and cool colours and seeing what are the warm blues, what are the cool blues, what are the warm reds, what are the cool reds, and trying to put these all in a chart so that you understand this a little better. I know I have a lot of questions about this and people are confused as to how a red can be cool when traditionally we think of it as a warm color, but there are kind of subsets. There's the warm colors and the cool colors, and then within that set of colors there's a subset of colors that have different properties. So we'll look at the color wheel, make a little chart, and you put down what paints you have on your chart and maybe leave a few spaces for some you might get in the future. And then the second thing we're going to do, the main focus of our lesson, is lost and found edges and hard and soft edges. And for this, we're going to use a picture I took of a coffee cup and 2 Danish pastries so that we can paint with just a very limited palette: ultramarine blue, burnt sienna, a little bit of raw sienna, and some alizarin crimson and yellow to make the centers of the pastries. So let's put the other camera on, let's get our paints ready, and here we go. Talking about our warm and cool colors, and what does that mean? They really confuse a lot of people, and people ask me over and over again, what are they? I don't get it. Because the reason is, most of us in school and in our life have learned that these colors, the reds and pinks and yellows, are the warm colors, and the blues and the greens and maybe some purples are the cool colors. And we've learned that, and we don't understand why some pinks are cool and some blues are warm. And it's so confusing that some people never get it. They just can't seem to get their head around it. So I thought I'd try another time, another way, and make a little chart. And on this chart here, I've got the cadmium red, which is really your true warm red primary. And then I've got quinacridone magenta, which is your cool primary. And you must all have color printers or have used a color printer. And you know that the inks you get are magenta, yellow, black, and I forget what the blue is called, cyan blue, which is very much like a phthalo blue. You don't get the warm red and the warm blue because they don't make true colors. And the true triad for any color is your cool red, your cool blue, and your kind of neutral yellow. And if you've got a printer, black, and of course on a printer, it's the white of your paper. In watercolor, we use the white of the paper and we tend not to use black. A lot of the manufacturers add black to the paints. I was checking today because my Payne's Gray, which is M. Graham, when I was testing it the other week, was granulating. So I was absolutely sure it had ultramarine blue in. And I checked the Daniel Smith ultramarine blue that I have, and that has PB 29 in it, which is pigment blue 29. And then I checked the Payne's Gray, and that has pigment blue 29 and pigment black 9. So it has black and ultramarine blue. That's how easy it is to make. Every manufacturer makes it slightly differently. Some might use a phthalo blue and a black and maybe a magenta. So it's very interesting. A lot of the colors, they will add a white to make the color lighter. If it's a cheap brand of paint, I have the Winsor and Newton Cobalt Blue, and they use the ultramarine blue pigment, which I just said what it was. I can't see, it's too small on this one. I should remember it, PB 29. So they've used that and they've added white to it to make cobalt blue a cobalt blue hue. It's not a true cobalt blue that uses the chemicals, it's a cobalt blue hue. So they've just used ultramarine and white, which is why it's so similar. So it's really, studying paint colors is really interesting. What we're looking at for warm reds is all the reds that are closer to the yellow side of the color wheel. Those are your warm reds. And then your cool reds are all of your reds that are closer to the blue side of the color wheel, and they kind of go through the purples and magentas as well before they get to the blue. Now your purples, yes, yeah.
I'm sorry to ask this very beginner question, but
Please ask a question. Yeah.
why do they call them warm and why do they call them cool? Why do they use those designations? What's the
Great. It's
purpose of
such a
it?
good question. It is what confuses so many people. They call them warm if they have a lot of yellow in the pigment. So if they have a lot of yellow in the pigment, closer to the yellows, they're called warm. If the pigment is made with some blue, they're closer to the cool because blue is cool. And if there is blue in the pigment, then they are cool. So all of these sort of from here, which is alizarin crimson on, have blue in the pigment, not yellow. There's hardly any yellow in there. So you won't be making a gray or a brown or a muddy color. And as I was just going to say, in the middle here, you have your violets and purples, and they are kind of like, if you have a Venn diagram, you know, where two bubbles intersect, these are kind of in the middle because you can call your violets and purples, you can call them cool pinks, or you can call them warm blues. They're one of those crossover sort of colors that could go either way. And they're kind of interesting. The same with your yellows. When you get over here, in your yellows, all these yellows are closer to orange, they're warm, they're orangey. Then you get closer here to green, and they're in your crossover zone too, because this lemon yellow is sort of greenish, it's tending towards the green, so it's cooler, it's not orangey and red. And then this really bright green here, which I think is a permanent green or a lime green, has a lot of yellow in. So it's sort of, although it looks very acidic, it's a warm green because it has lots of yellow in, but they're very much crossover colors in the middle of that like Venn diagram, cool, warm. As your greens get closer to your blues, they have more blue in them. And they are your cool greens because they're very blue greens. And again, when you get down to your ultramarine blue and your cobalt blue, down here, they are called warm blues because they have some red in the pigment that makes them much warmer, whereas some of the other ones like phthalo blue and Prussian blue, they have more green in their pigment that makes them cooler. So it really only matters when you're mixing to know this, because if you mix the wrong colors together, you don't get a lovely pure color. If you want a brown, like if you want a brown, mix an orangey red with a sort of a bluish green or a yellowy green, and you'll get a brown. But if you mix an orangey red with a blue, you'll probably get a brown. But if you mix a cool pink with a blue, you're going to get a more beautiful violet. So it's when you're mixing colors that it's important to know. And I know people are still going to feel confused. And like I say, with some of these crossover colors, they can go either way. You can put them in either bracket. But if you've got your little chart, or if you've got it somewhere ready to put some color, let's start. This is the warm category, but then I've put subsets. So in the warm category, you've got a subset which is warm and a subset which is cool within the whole warm category. That's what's so confusing. And I want to start with, if you have one and you want to make a chart, let's just start with a cadmium red, because that has always been like your warm red, red that's got some yellow in it, fairly warm, and it's a red. And I think I've explained, I still have cadmium red in my palette, but I won't be buying more when it's run out. I have changed to this Pyrrole red, and that is just as bright as cadmium red. I needed a lot of space here for all my warm colors. Really gorgeous, bright, vibrant red, a warm red. So if you mix these with the wrong colors, you're going to get grays and blacks and browns, rather than, you might want a purple or some other color. And you need to remember that they're more like an orange. So you're not going to get that pure color that you want if you mix them with the wrong color. Now I've got so much paint around here. Scarlet Lake. Scarlet Lake is a very old-fashioned color. You don't see it used very much anymore. And I have a very old palette here. Look at this old thing. This palette is, well, let's see, 35 years old, maybe something around that. Still got paint in from 35 years ago. And I know the date because when my children were little, my son is 38, nearly 39. When they were little, I sort of took up painting again. You know, when your kids are little, you need something to do. And I went to painting classes. So I bought this palette and put these paints in there, and they're still in there. And I have a Scarlet Lake in there, which is very, very orangey red, very warm red. So you might have a paint that's called Scarlet, or I don't know what all of them are called. Some of them just have names and they're made from 2 or 3 pigments, and the manufacturer makes them up. Vermilion is more of a traditional orangey red. So I have a vermilion here. Little bit, you can see it's a little bit more transparent than the, certainly a little bit more orangey than the Scarlet Lake. I wonder if I should zoom in so you can see even better what I'm doing. I'll move my palette over. There we go. And last year when I was teaching, I bought some student colors, some Van Gogh student colors. Really liked them. They were not expensive, sort of like $5.99 a tube. Very beautiful colors. And I bought the permanent red for my red in the Van Gogh colors. And this is the permanent red that I bought. Lovely and transparent. I really love it. And for a $5.99 tube of paint, student colors, I thought they were absolutely gorgeous. I have switched from cadmium yellow to Azo Yellow. I like the M. Graham paints, artist quality. I have never been disappointed by this Azo Yellow that they make transparent. It's like the perfect yellow. It's sort of a standalone. It mixes with everything, and I really love it. And I'm trying to ditch the cadmium colors, but I still have in my very, very old palette. Look at the state of this thing. It still has beautiful painting. It's all artist quality. It hasn't been used for years. So I'm just going in there, and this is the cadmium yellow. A little bit more orangey than the Azo Yellow, and a little bit more opaque than the Azo Yellow, which is why I like the Azo so much. Gamboge, it used to be that it was fugitive. Now, fugitive means that it fades easily. And you can usually get one now that's called New Gamboge, which doesn't fade. It is more light fast, and that is a very orangey yellow, and I believe they just mix a reddish color in with it to make it orangey. And you can make your own gamboge by putting a little bit of permanent rose or a little bit of Pyrrole red in with your yellow. Just the tiniest bit will orange it up. Cadmium orange, I don't like cadmium orange. I never paint with cadmium orange. I bought it to try it out. I just find it so opaque. But I have some, and that's cadmium orange sort of bleeding into my gamboge, making a rather nice effect. I do love transparent orange. Mine is by Quar Paints, came in a set, and it is very, very transparent. Yellow ochre, I don't like yellow ochre because it is, what's my word? I'm searching for, my brain suddenly goes to sleep. Opaque. But it is a lovely color. I prefer using it when I'm using oil or acrylic paint because they're supposed to be opaque. I just find with watercolor, it's a little bit too opaque for me. I prefer raw sienna, which is almost similar color, but far more transparent and just a little bit warmer. So these are all warm colors, and they're all in the warm subset of warm colors. Burnt sienna, usually I wouldn't put your neutrals like browns and grays in here, but the burnt sienna is so much like an orange that I always count it in there as a sort of orangey color. and I use it a lot. Now, this one is a Daniel Smith burnt sienna, which is, I find, a little bit more opaque than the Winsor and Newton burnt sienna. And quinacridone gold, beautiful, beautiful color. And that is like a raw sienna times 10. It stains, you cannot lift this color, but it's very transparent and extremely beautiful. So it'll give a real punch to your painting if you wanted that. So these are the warm colors I have. You may not have those colors, but if you have a question, like if you have a red or a yellow or an orange or blue, and you're not sure if it's blue, if it's warm or cool, just ask me and I will try and find. I've been looking at color charts all morning. So
you got a Winsor red.
Winsor red. I don't. Winsor red would be warm. And I believe it's Winsor and Newton's sort of take on like a Pyrrole red. Winsor and Newton quite often have their own names for things. Like they will have Winsor blue, which is phthalo blue. If it's the Cotman colors, they'll call it intense blue, but it's still phthalo blue. Winsor green is like a phthalo green. And I'm not quite sure exactly what their Winsor red would be, but I would say it would be somewhere between cadmium red and Pyrrole red. It would definitely be a warm red. Sure, I'd have to look it up to be certain, but I've never had one, so
It looks warm to me.
okay, then go with what it looks like. You hopefully, if we do this, everybody should be able to sort of start figuring it out. Now, ultramarine blue is most definitely your main warm blue. It has red in the pigment. And you can get ultramarine blue green shade, which is cooler and has more green in the pigment. And some of these colors, you can get them in red shade or green shade if you go to the artist quality, and that will give you either a cooler or a warmer version. Definitely things like phthalo blue. You can get phthalo blue green shade, phthalo blue red shade, or just sort of phthalo blue on its own. Cobalt blue, as I said, is quite often made by the manufacturers with ultramarine blue and white, or if it's an expensive one, it will be made with the cobalt pigments. And again, it is a warm blue. It has more red in the pigment, and you can see as I put it down, it is so similar to ultramarine blue. It's a gentle blue. You can get ultramarine blue very deep. You can't get the cobalt to go really deep. You know, if I added a lot more ultramarine, charged it in, I can get a really intense color, but you can't really get that with the cobalt. It's slightly lighter. I also have somewhere here an ultramarine deep. Oh, it's right in front of me. And that's also fairly warm. It's just a deeper, actually warmer, even warmer ultramarine blue. So that's an ultramarine deep. All these colors will be sort of changed a little bit by different manufacturers to make them a little bit more green, a little bit more red, a little bit more intense. They sort of play around with them a little bit. Cobalt violet. I'm trying to remember where I have my cobalt violet. And this is again one of those ones where it could be either or. I know. Oh, here it is. I just love you can get all these little tester cards from the paint companies, quite often from free. I have a core one, I have a Holbein one, I have another Holbein one, and you can just sort of test out their colors with them. So I've never bought, I don't think, I might have bought the Cobalt Violet. I don't like it very much. It's a bit insipid, but it's definitely a warm, oh, see how insipid that is? I just can't make anything of it. I don't really like it very much. This is a really good quality paint too, and it's not doing much. It's I wonder if I have one over here. No, don't think so. Anyway, not one of my favorites, Cobalt Violet, but it's definitely in the pinkish tone, and it could go down here in the cool reds. It's sort of one of those crossover ones. Pyroline violet. Now I had all these, right at my fingertips earlier on to find them all. Where's this one? Got them all out in front of me. Can't find my Pyroline violet. I don't know where it went. I've got so many paint charts here. Well, you'll have to wait on that one because I don't know where my Pyroline violet is. Oh, I know where it is. Sorry about that. I was looking up Theo Violet, and not many people make Theo Violet anymore, but they make, some of them make one that's called that with different pigments. Most of them are making, instead of Theo Violet, Pyroline Violet or Mayan Violet. And I have the original Winsor Newton one in my, this is the original, not available anymore, Theo Violet in my Winsor Newton palette, and that is a very, very gorgeous warm violet. And again, you could say that's also a cool pink. It's right in the middle. For the greens, there's not many greens that you could really call a warm green, but sap green is closer to yellow. It's quite close to yellow, has quite a bit of yellow in. So you can sort of put sap green in the warm greens because it has quite a lot of yellow in it, and it will mix beautifully with yellow. Same for green gold. Green gold is a very, very yellowish golden green. So a very warm green goes with the yellows. Permanent green light is one of those on the border, but again, a yellowish green. I want to buy the M. Graham version of this. This is a very cheap version over here. I would like to get the M. Graham version because it is such a gorgeous bright green color, very difficult to mix. So I think I want to buy that one for no reason except I love paint. And the last one, lime green, I have over here. This is my lovely little palette of Kuretake paints. This is a lime green, very close to yellow, very bright, gorgeous color. I really shouldn't have to go out and buy permanent green light if I have that lovely light green. I'm just being a little bit ridiculous about buying paint. So for me, looking at all my colors this morning, that was all of my warm blues and greens, and definitely easy to find all your warm yellows and oranges. It's everything that looks orange and yellow. But now we come down to the trickier ones for people, and that is looking at see, you have to really think, looking at cool reds, because we think of red as warm always. So I want to quickly grab my scissors. Where did I put them? Here they are. I just want to cut my chart for making it easier to get it under the camera. That's the only reason. You don't need to cut your chart. I just need mine under the camera where you can see it, and I don't have space. So it doesn't matter. I can put my other chart in a little pocket. I keep all these charts. They're very, very useful. So a cool yellow, very few cool yellows because they're all warm, but a lemon yellow would be pretty cool. It's closer to green. And again, it's one of those crossover colors because your yellowish greens are your warm greens and your greenish yellows are your cool yellows. So a lemon yellow, sort of showing up a little bit more warm on my camera than it is a sort of a greenish yellow, and will mix beautifully with green to make those light greens. I wouldn't say there's a couple of other yellows that are available, but I don't have them that might be cool. Alizarin crimson has always been the main cool red to be mixing beautiful violets and beautiful purples. I just got to get to my alizarin over here. So this color has more blue in the pigment. And it mixes beautifully with blue because of that. It doesn't have the yellows and the oranges in the pigments. But of course you can mix it with the yellow to make it more like a cadmium red. That is what your printer does. When your printer mixes the magenta to make an orange or a red, it mixes it with the yellow in your printer to make that color. So if I just, you know, if I have my cool alizarin and I mix it with a nice warm yellow, I'm just going to do that. I'm just going to put it, where shall I put it? Over here on my warm colors. I don't want to mix them up. So I've just mixed my alizarin with some warm yellow and got myself a nice warm red by doing that. So you can warm it up, but you can't cool it. You can't really cool it down once you've added your yellow, because now you've got orange. If you put blue in it, you get gray. So it usually only goes one day. Quinacridone magenta, very, very strong magenta. You might have any type of magenta. You might have just magenta. You might have permanent magenta. This is close to what is in your printer. Very cool. You can almost see that it has a lot of blue in that color. And mix that with a cool blue and you get the most gorgeous violet like we did last week. Permanent rose, my favorite, absolute favorite cool color. It's so versatile. It mixes with everything. It's not as staining as the magenta, not as strong if you want a gentler look to your painting. So anything that has rose in the name is usually on the blue side. Rose madder I don't use very often. It's a more brownish sort of rose, but it's still very pretty and it's still a cool rose color. So it's kind of fairly close to permanent rose, but when it dries it has more of a brownish tinge. Opera rose, you can't find any color like it. It is bright, it is almost fluorescent. The sad thing is it fades very quickly and it's what's called fugitive, and they haven't found a way yet to stop that happening. Some people love using the opera rose because it's so bright, but the paintings will fade over time. And if you just love to do something that's good for a few years and you just want to send someone a beautiful card or something, it doesn't matter because it's going to last a few years. What it won't last is 50 or 100. And that's the sad thing about many of the dead painters now, you know, historical painters, especially the Impressionists. Van Gogh was using lots of experimental colors that were becoming brand new in tubes, and he loved them and he loved how bright they were. And they knew at the time that they probably would fade. And he thought that mixing them with other colors would maybe slow that down. And sadly, it hasn't. Some of his paintings, the beautiful pinks he used have faded down to white. And many of his paintings, the reds have faded, leaving blue colors where he had painted something purple. Now is blue in his painting. So the reds that he loved and the pinks he loved have faded away to almost nothing. And he knew that that might happen, but he said he loved the colors so much. Quinacridone rose, I have. Anything that has quinacridone in the name is going to last and probably stain. And this is a beautiful, beautiful blue transparent rose color. A little bit like quinacridone magenta, but not quite so intense. And then I have one that's just called Rose in my student paints. And I think it's quinacridone rose with some white added, because sometimes they add white to the colors to lighten them, which makes them more opaque. And that's just the rose that I have. So these are all of your cool reds. They are bluish reds compared to, if you look at them against the warm reds that are very orangey, you can tell these are more towards violet and these are more towards orange. And sometimes people that don't paint and don't know much about color, they will dispute with you whether a color is red or orange. they don't see the nuance there, and they will have an argument about whether something is red or orange. And really it could be anything here in this subset of warm reds that they will quite often call orange. We have lots of cool blues, just like we have lots of warm reds. In fact, most of the blues are cool. Cerulean is probably the main one that most paint sets have. Cerulean is Latin for sky blue. So it's a great one for painting skies. It is a little bit opaque, but it can be diluted with water to make a beautiful, beautiful light color. I just put a little bit of water along the edge there. Probably see that, you can lift the paint off. It's not permanent. It doesn't stain. Whereas phthalo blue, which is similar when it dries, got some phthalo blue, is much more intense, more transparent, more intense, but still a beautiful color for skies, because as it dries, it does fade down and make a lovely, lovely blue sky. Prussian is, I think it's phthalo with black added. It's another blue color, very, very pretty. Very pretty, cool blue. Lovely if you want to make some dark grays and blacks. And indigo again is another one that has some black added by most of the paint manufacturers to darken down the blue. Payne's Gray, the one I have, like I said, is ultramarine blue with black added by the Graham manufacturers. Other manufacturers might use a different combination, but I like this one, and I like that it granulates, I guess, with the ultramarine in it, makes it a granulating one. Turquoise, where is my turquoise? I know it's here somewhere. Give me a minute while I just find it. It's right here. Its third one in should be this one. I quite like, oh, there it is. If you're buying a student quality paint, I quite like the turquoise because it's not quite as intense as the phthalo blue, not quite as staining, but it still gives a beautiful bright blue effect. The phthalo colors, phthalo green and phthalo blue, very strong, very intense. They're beautiful for mixing. Phthalo green. I prefer, now Viridian is very similar, and a lot of Viridians that you get in a tube are made with phthalo green, but they are less intense. And I don't like that. My Viridians always seem to dry up, and my phthalo green is always moist. So I don't like that about Viridian, that it will dry up easily. I think maybe what they do is, I think they put white with phthalo green to make Viridian, and that makes it very chalky. So that's a Viridian there. They are extremely similar. D Violet, my favorite violet color. And of course this could go, you know, this could go with the warm blues probably because it has some red in it. It could go with the cool pinks. It is, if you're talking violet, it is on the cool violet scale. So you kind of, again, it's another subset. It's the subsets of violets and colors that can go in between. And ultramarine violet, which is a little bit gentler than D Violet, easier to lift, and I believe it has some ultramarine blue in it to just make it a more gentle color. Definitely in violets, these are cool violets. They're wet, so the light is shining off of them a little bit. So I don't know if you've been able to keep up and find colors in your palette And I don't know if that answers any questions that you may have. We can talk about that later. I just want to, if you have paints already, then that's great. If you don't and you're not sure what to get, there's just so many different paints that you can get. I like, this is my little travel box. It's the Koi travel box. It has just little colors in, a little water brush, a tray that comes out for an extra tray. So handy, just fits in any of my bags or suitcases and has beautiful colors in it. So I really love this little box of paints. And if you're just starting out, a little box of paints like this, I think would just be wonderful because it has most of the colors in there. What I did do was I took out the black and the white and I put my own phthalo blue and burnt sienna in there. I don't think it had those colors in. So that was lacking. I don't really like it when they put the white and the black in the paint boxes. They're totally unnecessary. Another type of paint that I like is this liquid watercolor ink. These are just gorgeous. This is deep orange. I'll just put a little bit in a tray here and get my warm chart, and I'll add it down here. Oh, look what a mess I made of that already. These are so beautiful and intense and transparent. This is this deep orange ink. And of course you can mix them with water and use them exactly like you use a watercolor, but they're all already liquid. I like to have these little trays to put them in. If they dry up, you just add water and use them after they've dried up, the same as watercolor. They are lovely. Lots of different manufacturers make them. I have this lovely box of Kuretake paints. They don't have the oxgall in, so they don't spread as much, but they keep nice and moist. They're very beautiful colors. And then of course tubes. You can buy tube paints and fill your own paint boxes with the tube paints. You can buy very inexpensively on Amazon. You can buy a paint box. I'm going to just zoom out for a minute. And buy a paint box that's empty and just fill it up with your own tube paints if you want to have a custom paint box. And like I say, I've got just a ridiculous amount of paints here. If you're not sure, you can get these little free paints from the paint stores with the little paint bubbles on, or sometimes you can buy them. You can buy the big ones to try them all out with little paint bubbles on that last really well. So there we go for a little bit of warm up, a little bit of finding out what paints you have and what you can do with them. And then we'll get on with the coffee cups. Let's get my stuff out the way. Get my drawing over here. And my two samples. So this was the first one that I did. I did this on the cheat paper. I always work out my paintings first on the cheat paper to see what's happening and what I'm going to do with colors. Very hard to work on cheat paper. And then I switched to my good paper and did the final copy to kind of figure out what I wanted to do. And I think I sent you the photographs too. So I photographed this. So I like to use my own photographs if I can. So I don't know if you have yours drawn ready. I did send a little outline, and you can use graphite paper. You can use tracing paper. I have a little light box that I can trace through to do that. And I'm just hoping that you have this pre-drawn. If you don't, you can watch what we do and maybe catch up later with the video, or catch up while I'm getting clean water, which I should actually, I'm just going to swap it out. My water over there. I've got 2 buckets of clean water here because I want to make sure that I have the colors really clean for starting this one. And I could just clean up my orange. I don't want any orange in this at all. I want to keep it all these lovely muted colors, which is the burnt sienna, the raw sienna, the ultramarine blue, and just for a little accent, I did a couple of colors for the center of the pastries. This one was a lemon one, but I really liked it when it had the cherry there, because in all this kind of neutral color, that little bit of cherry kind of popped in the center there, which I really liked. And I even watched a video on how they're made, because I could see that they were twisted and then rolled. You can kind of see the twists, and I found out that they have like a long, I should make a long strand of, I don't have any dough, sorry, didn't have time to make dough, but they would have like a long strand of dough about this size. And then you may have made Danish pastries, I never have, and then they twist it like this, so it's twisted, and then they curl it around like that and let it rise. And I could see that twisted and kind of curl pattern here. I just wasn't sure how that happened. So when you're painting something, it's so vital to kind of know how that shape is formed. Otherwise you don't really know what you're painting, and that can always look a little bit blurry and indistinct. So I'm just curious about things like that. I'm going to pop mine there so I can see it. Kind of want to see what I've done before. And I need to make up some paint before I start. Quite often I say to you, you know, let's wet it and then start, but we're not going to do a lot of wet and wet with this. So you need to, and I need to make up a gray using the ultramarine blue and the burnt sienna first. I got to find mine now. Had all my paint boxes out and kind of lost track. I want to make that a kind of a bluish gray, so more of the ultramarine blue in there. I also want to have some raw sienna ready, so for adding, and some burnt sienna ready.
Is there a substitute at all for a raw sienna?
Yes, you can use yellow ochre. I would say the only substitute for raw sienna is yellow ochre. There isn't much else. It's an earth color. Do you have a yellow ochre?
I do.
Okay, yeah. So I just prefer the raw sienna because it is more transparent, but a lot of painters and a lot of people love the yellow ochre, and it is a beautiful color. So I mean, feel free to use it, please. What did I just put there? Did I put burnt sienna there? Okay, raw sienna. Yeah, I was just going to put that there, I think. Of course, raw sienna and burnt sienna are the same pigment. They are both PB something. And one is just, I don't know if they do actually heat it. I think they probably do to darken it. And I would also like some ultramarine blue here to add some accents to the shadows. We're going to work on the shadows first. The very first shadow is going to be in here, and the darkest part of the shadow inside the cup is right here, and we're going to blend that shadow out with some water. Do you remember a couple of weeks ago we did that exercise where we washed the paint back? I'm going to go to my number 4 brush. Now I've mixed my paint. So I want to use the gray that I made with the ultramarine blue and burnt sienna, and start right and add a little bit more burnt sienna. When I first put my paint down, I decide then I should actually do it on a piece of spare paper, but I don't. I usually just start painting and then decide. Put that down fairly intense because I want it to be darkest at this edge here. And then I'm going to add a bit of water to that paint and drag it around the cup. A little bit more water, a bit more water. Drag it around the cup here. I'm just going to add a little bit of raw sienna, so I have a reflection right here. That's just a touch of raw sienna, or if you've got yellow ochre, a touch there. It's kind of a reflection of the coffee tea, whatever you want to put in your cup, and a little bit of echoing of the pastry. And now I'm going to get a little bit more gray on my brush, but a lot of water. I'm going to zoom in so you can actually really see the cup as I'm painting. A little bit more water coming around, and now this side is going away from you again, so I want to darken up my gray. I'm adding a little bit of blue to it and getting a little bit darker as I go away from the light again around here. And all of these colors will lighten up as they dry. I just dried my brush a little bit, and I'm going to manipulate those colors with a slightly dry brush so I don't put too much extra water in there. I can charge. Remember that charging, we just add a little bit of color into your wet paint. Can't add it at this side because this side's too dry, but this side I've just put water there so I can add it. So what we have is dark as it comes away from you, light as it rounds into the light, and then dark as it goes away from you. The cup you will always see a rim on the cup. I've got a pencil line at the moment. I'm going to go to my much smaller brush, the number 2 brush. I still have this gray, and add the rim, outside rim of the cup, but I still have that color. As I get to here, I'm going to skip. I'm not going to put any line there. This is all about lost and found edges. So I found the edge here, went around it, then I've lost it, lost the edge, start again, find the edge, come around, and we can, here I'm going to lose the edge and then find it again, come around, going to lose it there, and maybe do a little bit more of it over here. On this edge, I'm going to find the edge just there, and then I'm going to lose it down here. Underneath this found edge, I've got a little bit of water on my brush, just a tiny bit of water, and I want to just wash that line back a little bit into a very light wash, just there. The lost and found edges are about making the viewer do the work, which is interesting for the viewer, because they have to, the person viewing the painting has to make up this edge in their brain, and doing things like that is much more interesting to a viewer than having everything laid out for them. It makes your painting more interesting too. We want to do that for the handle, and the way to paint is to try and do all the parts that you can do not sort of wet in wet, so that these parts are drying, and then when we go back to do this wet in wet part, these parts are already drying, and we don't have a lot of bleeding happening where we don't want it happening, because not only have we got lost and found edges, we've got hard and soft edges. So far, most of these edges have been hard. This edge here is soft. We added water and we softened it up. But we want to put in some hard edges now on the handle of the cup. And right under here, right under this edge of the handle, it is dark. It is away from the light. So this is going to be your hardest, darkest edge right there. It's going to get softened now with a little bit of water. I put water on my brush and then taken a little bit of water off so it's not too wet. I'm going to get a little bit of raw sienna or yellow ochre, if that's what you have, as a reflection from the pastries coming down softer color. I've added a bit of water to that and a little bit of the gray inside here where it's away from the light again, going closer to the cup. Lovely to have a variety. We've got the darker gray. I'm going to add even a little bit of ultramarine blue just up there, just charge a little bit of ultramarine blue in for a bit more shadow. Got the darker blue gray coming down to the raw sienna, going back into a very, very soft gray here. So you've got a variety of grays and colors that are all reflecting your pastries and your cup. Assuming that the cups that I photograph were mostly white or a sort of bone color. Hard edge, want to make a hard edge of the other side of the handle and coming down here. Not all the way down. And again, I've left a little bit where I haven't attached the two. Just to here, I'm going to do the other edge with the background painting, with the negative painting. All of this is starting to dry enough that we can do the middle of the cup here with some wet in wet. You all keeping up okay? So the reason I have all this ready, the paint ready, is because I want to make sure that I can do the middle of the cup without stopping, and carefully, really carefully with my water. We don't want to wet everything with the water because then our paint's going to whoosh right over to the other side. I just want to wet this middle area where I want the paint to stop and dissolve into the water. So I'm just going to just lightly wet this area before I start to paint. Take some of that gray. And I might need to add a little bit more paint to the gray. It doesn't matter if it's the same gray that you had before. It never matters if it's the same gray. It doesn't matter if it's different every time you pick up your paintbrush. I want it a little bit intense at the corner. I'm going to wash my brush, dry it off a little bit on my towel, and use some water to pull that color around so it's not so intense as I come around the cup. I'll wet that. I'm going to have a little bit of switch to ultramarine blue. Just switch to a little bit of ultramarine blue. Tiny bit of burnt sienna, a little bit of burnt sienna on my brush. I want these colors mixing wet in wet on the cup. A little bit of the raw sienna or your yellow ochre. And this is where you can get too opaque with your yellow ochre if it's not diluted really well. Coming down with my darker gray again, letting them mingle. A little bit of ultramarine blue. I'm switching again, ultramarine blue on the bottom of the cup. A bit of burnt sienna. Go around the bottom of the cup here, make it curved. A little bit of the gray, that next to that. And maybe a little bit more up here, just there. Now I'm just going to leave that. It's going to leave that to sort of fuse all on its own, go into that water that I put on there. I have a little bit of a background here. I'm going to leave that alone. I don't mind. It's going to be a wet in wet look at the cup. What I can do on the other side of the cup here is when this is dry, I can put in some background to show the other side of the cup using my background color. But at the moment this is wet, so I don't want to do that because it doesn't matter, but I'll get a big rundown, and at the moment I just don't want that to happen. Now I have a choice now, and you have a choice always. I can put some of the background color on for the pastries, or I can put the coffee in the cup. And I think since my pastries are separated from this by about 5 millimeters of space, I can easily work on my pastries, and it's not going to touch anything on the cup. So I don't have to worry about that. I'm going to go to a smaller brush, my number 4. And this time for the pastries, I'm going to mix yellow with the raw sienna or your yellow ochre, so that I have a very warm, slightly yellow color. That's the color of the lovely, you know, baked pastries. It's not just raw sienna, which is a very earthy color, and it's not just yellow, it's a combination of the two. A little bit more raw sienna in, or yellow ochre, and quite diluted. And this is going to be the base color for the pastries. Now you're going to put on, after this base color, you're going to put on browns and some grays to put in the other colors, but the base color is just going to be this kind of pastry color. And I want to paint, you can either use masking fluid on the white, or you can practice very careful painting. And I might even switch to my number 2 brush for the careful painting. I want to practice careful painting and paint in between the white areas. I've drawn them all on carefully, so I know where they are. And this is a better method. I find that painting with masking fluid is incredibly imprecise. It often comes out all kind of blobby. You don't know what it's going to look like when you're finished. Whereas if you're actually painting around the white, if you can, you have a good idea of what's happening as you paint. You don't have to guess. And I'm sort of painting where around where the icing is. Remembering that these pastries are, like I said, they're twisted. So you kind of have these twists. This curve here is the outside edge of the twist right there. And there's a little bit of pastry showing between and we're not going to leave the icing pure white. It's going to have a little bit of very light gray shadow on it when you've finished everything else on your pastry. Painting each section sort of individually, because that way you get a bit of a line where the paint is, and that even gives you a bit of a delineation between the different sections. And I know our remit sort of, this is loose. This is not quite so loose, but you are getting that kind of loose wet in wet look. And I can't keep up the loose for everything. We need a little bit of care and attention sometimes. That's going to be jam in the middle there. And it really doesn't matter where your icing goes, as long as you have kind of drizzles of icing on your bun. A little bit coming out there. And remembering that the center is going to be either your lemon or your cherry jam. And you can see this is kind of a careful way of painting. What's happening while we're doing this is all this is starting to dry, so it's allowing us to go back and work on the background quite soon without having to fuss with a hairdryer. And the one behind. So it's a good excuse to eat pastries. We sort of haven't been having pastries and cakes and buns, but they came in a pack of 6, so we had to eat them. It was a lovely excuse to have something sweet and tasty. And around here. So that's the first layer of the pastries on that raw sienna and yellow mix. And all of this now should be dry enough to do the coffee. What I sometimes do, because I'm very, very bad at putting my wrist in wet paint, is I often turn it upside down for something like this and keep all that wet paint away from my hand. And I can paint the coffee without touching any of the wet paint. Again, we are using the Ultramarine blue and burnt sienna. My paint over a little bit. I have my puddle. But this time, of course, we're painting coffee, so we want way more burnt sienna in the mix than blue. It's not a blue-gray mix, it is a dark brown mix. So lots of burnt sienna, lots of pigment. The difference between the colors is but how much water do you add to the pigment. If you want this to be tea, you can put more water and more burnt sienna so that it's more of a tea color. I would like this to be coffee, really, because I want the intense color to match the intense color of the cherry in the middle of the pastry. So I have some balance in the painting. I want to have a little highlight in the coffee, so I've left a little highlight that's been drawn there. And let's switch to my number 4 brush, a bit more burnt sienna, a little bit more brown color. Surprising, it looks different on the paper to on the palette. Such a strange thing. And very carefully go along the, it's actually easier to paint up this way, painting that lovely edge of the coffee cup. And it will curve around on the inside of the cup. And all that paint should be dry from the first painting you did of the inside of the cup. I'm just going to leave a little highlight in the coffee where it's wet and reflecting light, makes it look like liquid. A little bit here. And sometimes it looks dark when you put it on, but then as it dries, it's not as dark, and you sometimes have to come back and do a second shadow on that area. Bring that around here. And I probably will have to, I'm going to do just and then pull just a tiny bit of that dark brown just around the rim, just there, just on the inside of the rim, just to make that just a little bit darker. Fade it in with my wet brush, and maybe just there. Can't get my brush wet enough there. There's a little bit there. A little bit. Right, and turn it up the right way. Have a look. Sometimes you see, let's see, I've got wet paint there, and turn it this way. What I see happening here is I have a little bit of a line that's not quite how I'd like it right there. Need to just use my wrist, my elbow and everything to see. I've got my hand actually resting down here to make sure I can get a clean line going around the coffee on the edge of the cup. It will, like I said, it's going to fade a little bit. If you feel that you want more of a light reflection here, you can use a thirsty brush just once I've washed it, dried it, and I can scoop up a little bit of paint there, but do it once, that's all. No more than that, because you're going to start having a mess right there. It just makes a little highlight in the coffee that's not as sharp. This is a soft highlight. Remember from the beetroot last week, this is a soft highlight. This is a hard highlight here. If you touch this paint after it's done, you're going to get streaks and a mess in it. And that one That one swipe with a thirsty brush is all you can do before you start to get a real mess in the paint. If you keep painting, you're going to get streaks and you're going to take that paint off. You need to let it all settle. And I'm just touching this. This is still a little bit wet, but I think it's dry enough to do the background color. So what we have in the background color here is a whole combination of those colors we've already been using, the burnt sienna, the gray, the ultramarine blue, and the raw sienna, sort of all around here, and then faded out with a wet paintbrush. You don't want this shadow too intense. The only place that it's fairly dark is between the pastries and the cup here, and just under the pastries here. So you don't want a lot of dark paint happening, and you don't want it to go up too high either. See, this one only goes up a short way. I've even got quite a hard line here, but it's such a soft color that it's barely noticeable. So it's probably best to start with this side of the cup, and I want to get a very, very watery gray again. I'm going to mix a bit more ultramarine blue in with that color. So it's my coffee. I've got my coffee color, and I'm putting some more ultramarine blue in it to get back to that light gray and some water. A really nice light, very light gray. Trying to get everything so you can see it, but I don't want all the paint getting all over the white paper is what I'm trying to avoid. Bigger brush. I've gone to my number 8 again. Coming in with this, oh, too dark. See, I've already decided it's too dark. A little bit more water, and take that down a notch with some water. Come up to the side of the cup, and I'm going to leave that as sort of a hard edge here. I'm going to go into the slightly more burnt sienna paint and come up to the bottom of the cup. The raw sienna paint, going into the raw sienna. Ultramarine blue, just ultramarine blue on my brush. I can darken these shadows later. They don't have to be dark all at once. It's easier to get in your paint all in a light sort of shade, and then later go back and darken some areas if you're, otherwise you're going to be too dark too quickly. Layering is the key to doing a good job with watercolor. Go under these. I just charged in a little bit more color here. You have to be careful, because if you charge in too much, you're going to get a lot of backgrounds and strange things happening. They have to all be the kind of same consistency. Want it darker close to the pastries. I'm getting some raw sienna and a little bit of burnt sienna. I'm going out, wetting that as I go away from the pastries. Did a no-no there. I went too strong with my brush. The pastries are a yellowy golden color, so I want to be mostly blue against that yellowy golden color so that they show up. I'm going into just the ultramarine blue at the moment, letting it mix with some of that burnt sienna. Got the gray that I have, mixing it with the ultramarine. I want some gray. I'm going to wet this area so that I don't have any hard edges here. I'm going to wet it. See, I got a hard edge right there. Put some paint in that. we had the other edge of the handle that wasn't painted. I'm going to use some negative painting to show that up, just there. And this paint should just flood up into that water that I just put on there. I've used a lot of sort of bluish gray near the pastries so that they show up that orangey golden yellow against the bluey gray. I also on the original put a tiny bit of bluey gray inside here, a little bit, and washed that, a smaller brush, wash that back just into a very watery mix. So it's not too strong, it's just a suggestion in there. And I think, put a little bit of dark after that's dry. You don't want to do too much while it's wet. Otherwise you're going to get backruns and odd things happening. I was watching a really good artist on YouTube the other day explaining wet in wet and what you can do. And he said, you can never put wet on damp paper. And I realized then that that is so true. This paper here is damp now. It's just starting to dry. If I put anything on there, it's going to do something horrible. It's either going to backrun, or it's going to make a hard edge, or some kind of an effect that I don't want. It needs to be either wet or perfectly dry. But damp paper is your enemy. And he said there's very few rules, and I agree with him, but putting paint on damp paper is one good way to ruin your painting or get an effect that you just don't want in your painting. So if I want more shadow, which I do, I have to wait till all of this all this background's dry before I can put a bit more shadow in there. And you do too. If you feel that this is not dark enough, or you need a little bit more intensity, you have to wait till this is dry. You can't do it when it's damp. You can, but you won't like it, I don't think. What I can do is, most of these pastries are dried up, so I can actually work on these while I'm waiting for the background to dry. What I really would like to work on is putting the lovely jam in the middle here, so I've got another dark or a dark value to echo the coffee value. I used mostly alizarin crimson, one of our cool reds, remember? I just find my alizarin crimson, there it is. Seems to be the perfect color for a nice dark cherry jam, just like it was a good color for the beetroot. And I want it to have some highlight because it's that shiny sort of jelly texture. And I'm going to put that in very, very carefully. I will be putting a little bit more dark on it after the first layer is dry. A little bit of ultramarine mixed with it later. We'll put the dark layer on there. And again, I'm going to be very disciplined with my little tiny number 2 brush, or number 1 brush you could use, and leave those little sparkles of white where the jelly is catching the light, that shiny jelly. If you don't manage to leave those shiny parts, you can put that on with some white paint afterwards, or white pen. That's always my go-to solution if I lose them. I just charged in a little bit more alizarin crimson in there. And the one over here was a lemon one. So this is one time when I want to use my lemon yellow, because it was a very lemony. If you don't have a lemon yellow, then just whatever bright yellow you have is fine. I do have a lemon yellow, so I'm going to use that in this one here. And remember, the first layer you put on is just your main color. You're going to put some shadow and other colors in when that's dry. Oh, a little bit of lemon yellow there. Also, all of this pastry color is dry enough to start putting on some burnt sienna to make the areas look baked. And burnt sienna is your best color for this. I have some just sitting right here. And I'm going to start with, I'm not going to start with that edge because it's wet. I think I'm just looking at for my driest edge. I think this is the driest edge here. Definitely at the edge where it's closer to the table will be darker as it's going away from you. And I have to say, this is not very loose at all this week, is it? The only bit that's really kind of loose is your background color. The edges of the icing have shadow underneath them, so you can also use your burnt sienna to go under the edges of your icing to give it some shadow. You can come back later with some ultramarine blue to deepen that, but right now use your burnt sienna. And there are some, I'm just putting in some like cracks in the pastry where it's folded, and you can actually see those sort of curved lines as it folds around. And charging in, I've got a little bit more burnt sienna, charging that in. This is still just a little bit wet, charging in a little bit extra here. Rather than loose, this is careful, this part. I want to get the same thing. Remember when we did the beetroot last week, I said paint in the direction of the beetroot. Well, here the pastry is curving around here, and we're pulling our paint in that direction, wetting the brush, just a wet brush now, and pulling that paint around in that curve and putting it underneath where we've got some shadow here, and at the edge of the icing, shadow, because the icing is lifted up off the surface and it actually creates just a tiny shadow as it does so, pulling that up. So we've still got the light color of the pastry showing, but we're also seeing the baked edge of the pastry. I'm putting a little bit more burnt sienna on that bit at the top here. The burnt sienna can be varied, and it should be varied by adding a little bit of ultramarine blue now and again to just take it down a notch so it's not quite such an orangey color. And I've just done that. I've bring that underneath here. So I have my burnt sienna here. I'm trying to get that so it's not glistening. Burnt sienna here, and I've added a little bit of ultramarine here, so it's a sort of a duller brown, not quite so orangey for just around here. Oh, I forgot that area is a bit wet still. This is bordered with icing, so it should be okay. Around the edge of that icing, blend it in with a wet brush. And I have to be careful, that red's wet too, so I don't want to touch it too soon. I can avoid touching the red. You have to really be careful, but I don't like to stop and dry the painting. I don't like to stop the pigment settling properly into the paper. I don't like to take the time. I like to continue painting on the dry bits as much as I can. Sometimes it's unavoidable. You have to stop and dry. If you get to a point where you want to stop and dry your work because you're scared of getting your paint running too much, just stop and dry it. That's okay. I know I did that last week. I had to at some point. As you're painting all these little details, you'll probably feel it's all looking a bit bitty and strange. But you'll be surprised when you're all finished everything and you stand back and look at it as a whole. It will look like a pastry. You just have to get used to it looking a bit strange while you're close up to it. And do a little bit of dry brush and get my bigger brush, my number 8, and get some burnt sienna on there and tap it on my towel so it's almost dry, and test it on a piece of paper to see if it's, yeah, that's quite dry. And I'm going to use a little bit of dry brush on this one so it's not, tap it a bit more, not quite so strong. Just going to drag it down there, give the pastry a little bit of texture. Keep drying it on your towel if it's not dry enough. There we go. I'm going between my 3 favorite brushes. There was actually a question on my watercolor website today. What are your 3 favorite brushes? What couldn't you live without? And quite honestly, I could just get by with these 3. My Black Silver Velvet 8, 4, and 2. It's pretty much all I ever use. I can do everything with these 3 brushes, and that's what I put. I have lots of other brushes that are really useful, but these are my best friends, and I'm switching between them as I go to detail or wash or changing them up. And back to my number 4 right now. I think just to vary the color of the browning of the bun, I want to use, I'm going to make a bit more of that yellow and raw sienna mix that we use for the bun, and add a bit of burnt sienna to that. So I've got a slightly different mix for some of the browning of the bun. And I think just to change it up so it's not all the same, particularly this one here, which is kind of just lightly browned, and around this side. Just got a little bit more of the dark paint, and just let it flood into that light paint a little bit. Sometimes you need to mix a little bit more. Coming around this part of the bun. This is starting to dry up enough that I don't have to worry about it too much. And if when this is dry, you feel that it's not dark enough, then you can go back and you can do a little bit more. Best to go in gentle steps. That way you don't put any paint on that you regret. A bit of a shadow here. Bit more dry brush, just drying off my brush. I want a bit more texture on this one. Dry brush is hard. You have to get it just right that it will work with the texture of the paper. Kind of drag it over the paper to make a rough texture. When you have a light edge, it will only really show up if you have some dark beside it or around it. So this is the light edge of this one. I really want to get a bit of a dark edge to this one, bit of shadow, so that I'm going to get a bit of that combination mix there. pull that around. This one is a bit further away. We can go a bit darker with that one. You never want to have everything the same. You want to try and have light and dark values to slightly different colors so that it's not boring. That your viewer can look around your painting at everything and see different values and intensities and colors as their eye moves around the painting. And this is not as dark as I want it yet. I'm just going to go slowly, step by step. Now at this point, everything is sort of damp, which is a dangerous time. And this is a point where I definitely I'm going to pause the video and turn down my microphone, going to dry it with the hairdryer. And before I put the video on again, we can have like any questions or any problems or anything that you're experiencing. So right now we'll pause. So I've dried mine now for those that are watching the recording. We've talked a little bit about how I got some backgrounds here that I didn't really want, but it just happened. It's way better to just leave things like that than try and fix them. If you try and fix things like that, you'll get a worse mess. But what I want to do now is I want to put more shadow around the cup and around the pastries. And I need to put on the same dark gray, the ultramarine blue and the burnt sienna, and then wet it in with a wet brush that's not too wet. It's like that washing back that we practiced. Tricky to do, it really is. When I used, this is the Canson, the cheap paper, it was extremely hard to do it on that. You can't, on the cheaper paper, you really can't get that technique to work very well. This lovely soft cotton paper is helpful. So let's have a go. I want some dark gray, the ultramarine blue and the burnt sienna. I'm just going to mix up a little bit more. That's on the blue side, definitely, because I have the golden pastries there that I want to sort of showcase with a bluish shadow. So this is where I want my shadow darkest. So I'm going to start with the area that I want darkest in my shadow here and put that on first. It needs to be pretty watery, this paint. It cannot be too dry, otherwise it's not going to wash back effectively. Now you can use the same brush or a different brush for this. I could have a second brush that I use for washing back and keep that brush, just the other brushes full of paint. And you can't use too much water when you're washing back either. I want to get a little bit of burnt sienna into the washing back. I'm just going to put, I grabbed a little bit of burnt sienna to put in this water I just put here. And take some out there. I don't want the burnt sienna up against the pastry because they are burnt sienna. I want to have the more bluey gray to complement them. But I also want to have some of the burnt sienna that I have in the pastries over here. And I'm going to use the wet brush to soften this shadow, and a wet brush to soften the shadow here. I'm using a different brush so that I don't have to wash all of the paint. I've got paint on this brush. I don't need to wash all that out into my water bucket. I'm just going to keep it on the brush ready to go and use this second brush with a little bit of water in to soften that edge. And this is where the learning happens. How much water do you need on that brush to soften the edge? This is still a little bit wet, so I can charge in a little bit more color under that cup. But I'm pushing it. I'm really pushing it at the moment. I'm liable to get a mess there if I'm not careful. definitely want a nice dark shadow so that these pastries stand out. If you want something to stand out and look like they're sitting on a surface, you have to have quite a dark shadow, but it doesn't need to be a hard edge shadow. I'm taking that wet brush and softening that edge to pull that shadow out of there with a soft edge. We add a little bit more burnt sienna. Also might want to just touch up the edge of that handle, just there and just there, just a little extra found edge. Just putting a little bit of water on that. I'm never quite sure how much found edge I want. Whether I want this more found. I think I do want that edge a bit more found. And I think I want a little bit more burnt sienna in it too. I just want a little bit more burnt sienna. I'm getting into dangerous territory here, sort of like putting on extra paint. Not sure if I really want it, but it's on there now, so I gotta live with it. But I don't want a hard edge, so I have the paint on there, and I'm going to use a wet brush to just soften that edge. Maybe not just water, maybe I'll add a little bit of raw sienna. Also, this edge is really dried, and it's quite light now, so I want to have a bit more shading on this edge, the gray that I've made with the burnt sienna and the ultramarine blue. I just want a little bit more dark on that side of the cup so that it looks like it's more round. I just put a little bit of ultramarine blue in there. And again, pull that around with a wet brush to soften that edge. This side too. It's not dark enough. And it's so surprising. You put on the paint and you think you've gone really dark, but as it dries, it lightens up so much. And wet brush just to soften that edge. The coffee too, I'm just going to use ultramarine blue, nothing else, just ultramarine blue. And you think, well, your coffee's supposed to be brown, but if I just put a little bit of ultramarine blue just here, and I don't even have to do a soft edge on that. I think I might leave that a hard edge because we're doing hard and soft edges. That's just ultramarine blue. There's nothing else added to that, just ultramarine blue. I'm just sort of putting in a hard edged shadow there on the coffee, on the side that's away from the light. If you feel that you need a little bit of an extra edge there, I put a little bit of ultramarine blue there. So you can, little tiny details like that are really helpful. On the jelly in the middle here, the Alizarin crimson is that lovely cool red. Here it is. I'm going to cool it down even more with some ultramarine blue. You might say, well, why are you using a warm blue, which is ultramarine blue, and not one of the cool blues? Because the cool blues would be much too vibrant. I just want it slightly darker red for the edges that are in shadow. I don't want it a super intense red. I got my tiny, I haven't got my tiny brush, tiny brush, my number 2. And I want to make this little piece of jam here look a little bit rounded too. So I'm putting a shadow around the edge of it, just here, and darkening up that edge so that it has some depth. The middle is still the pure alizarin crimson, might have a little bit there too. And definitely next to those white highlights, the darker you get next to your white highlights, the brighter they look. The yellow, the yellow pastry can have a little bit of the raw sienna and yellow to darken it down. So just a little bit, and also a little bit of the ultramarine blue with the yellow to make it a sort of a greenish. Remember, it's the lemon yellow, so it's already towards the greenish side. And a little bit, yeah, the yellow, a little bit of ultramarine blue. I don't want it too, and let's put a little bit of that greenish blue just around the edge of that. Don't want too much. I don't want it to look too green. Just a little bit. Now the complement of yellow is violet, so you could alternately to gray it down. It's a good color to use. This is its complement, so I'll try that as well. I've got the lemon yellow and a little bit of violet. That will make a sort of a grayish yellow. I made a little bit of gray yellow with that, and that's just as good. The only reason I didn't use the violet is that we haven't used any violet in this painting. I kind of like to go with what we have. But what I could use for violet, which we have used in this painting, thinking out loud, we have used the ultramarine blue and the alizarin crimson to make a sort of a violet color. I can add a little bit of that to the yellow to gray it down. Oops, sorry, I banged the camera rather than showed you what I was doing. Let's grab a bit more lemon so you can actually see what I'm doing. So here's the lemon. Take a little bit of this violet that we have, and that will just gray down your lemon a little bit, and it makes it very similar to the green that I made with the ultramarine blue, but maybe just a little bit more true to a shadowy color for the yellow. I don't want to lose too much of that yellow. Some of the other things that are good to do is take some very, very diluted ultramarine. Let's really dilute this down. Really dilute it down, and a touch of to gray down the ultramarine, use its complement, which is this orangey brown, just touch, not a lot. I don't mean make the gray. And these little icing areas can do with a little bit of shadow with that extremely diluted ultramarine, so that you have a little bit of shadow in your icing using that color. Not too much, because you want that lovely white icing. But there might be a little bit of shadow as this folds over, and just on this edge. Also, if you need a little bit of shadow on the edge of your icing still, you can use that very dilute ultramarine mix to put a little bit of shadow on the edge of your icing. It makes it stand out a little bit more. These are little tiny touches that you work on very sort of slowly towards the end of a painting to make it look a little bit more realistic, even though it's sort of very abstract and you're not seeing all the cup. And I'm looking at mine thinking, I don't want to fix this background. I'm not unhappy with it, but I would like just a little bit more burnt sienna in there. So I'm putting some water on here. I just feel that to echo the pastries, and in my original, I had a bit of burnt sienna there. I put some water on. I just put a little bit of burnt sienna on there. Maybe a little bit of that pastry color. Just wanted a little touch more warmth in the light color of that cup, but I needed to put the water on first so that it blended in with a very soft edge. And I think a little bit more shadow just there. Might just leave that a hard edge shadow right there. And of course, you can go back and forth making those judgments about what to do. You might even want a little bit more shadow here behind the cup and under the cup. Now this is dried, to show off that side of the cup. I'm not going to leave that hard like that. I'm going to soften it up a little bit with a wet brush. Just blend it in. And these steps are so tiny as you start to finish your painting. A bit more shadow here, a bit more here. Mostly ultramarine blue. Under the cup is a bit too damp, but I do want to put just a little bit more shadow under the cup as it dries. And also the pastry, I think, needs a second layer. In some places needs a second layer of brown. Again, the burnt sienna with the ultramarine blue, maybe a little bit of raw sienna, and a bit more baking. Needs a few more minutes in the oven here on the top, especially sort of right here where we've got the two coming up against each other. Getting a little bit more burnt sienna and some raw sienna. I've lost my cloth. I keep wiping my brush on my tablecloth here. I need my wiping cloth. And as you put the colors down, you have to always remember they're going to dry lighter. So you may be feeling it's a bit too dark until you get that dry, then you realize it's not as dark as you would like. And that's when you just come back with another layer. It's way easier that way. You can make your decisions as you go along. One bit of shadow here from this bun around the other one so that they look like two separate ones. And as you're putting in your shadows, don't lose. The only thing you have to be careful of is don't lose your lights as well. Don't shadow everything. Or you might just be going over the top of some of your shadows with a little bit more color, but don't lose your highlights as well. Touching this to see if it's still damp. I think it's fairly dry under the cup. I just don't want to have to stop and do the hairdryer again, but if you really want to make sure that your paint is dry before you put something in, do just stop and give it a blow with a hairdryer or heat gun so that you don't get an unpleasant back run happening, because that's a shame if you've done a good painting and then you get some backgrounds that you don't like. I'm just taking that up a little bit around the edge of the cup. The shadows are something you just sort of keep working on until you could just get them how you want them. They're definitely not a one-step, or very rarely a one-step deal. They're layer upon layer of pretty much the same color. But transparent color, you'll get very muddy shadows if you don't use a transparent color. And that's why I am so not loving yellow ochre, because it's not transparent. And if you did more than one shadow with it, you would definitely get some very opaque, muddy colors. But with transparent burnt sienna and transparent ultramarine blue, or at least translucent, I can put quite a few layers on top of each other and still have not sort of a muddy look to the shadows. Even right here where I've got one pastry in front of the other, this is just ultramarine blue on my brush right now, and I kind of want to make a little translucent shadow just with some ultramarine over the top of the orangey brown. It'll be better than putting more and more dark brown on there. So I think that is pretty much that little painting done. That's another thing. You can work on these little details for a while, putting a little bit, I've just put a little bit more dark just there. I think that needed a little bit more dark. But there comes a point you have to stop and say, that's it, painting done. We can't fiddle with it anymore. And I really think that mine has reached that point right now that I don't want to fiddle with it anymore. I think it's pretty much done. Anything I put on now is going to detract from what I've got there. If I felt that this highlight in the coffee was not quite highlighty enough, I can wash it back because it's dry now. If something's dry, you can definitely wash it back. I'd put a little bit of water there and just a little scrape with my Kleenex, and that just washed back a little bit more highlight in that coffee, which I felt that I wanted to put in there. And you can do that if you use these colors, they'll wash back beautifully. They're non-staining. The Alizarin crimson stains a bit, but the others don't. So that is our Danish pastries and our little warm up with the warm and cool colors. Thank you for joining me. I'm going to stop the recording. Well, thank you for joining me again this week. How did your coffee cup turn out? How did your paint chart turn out? I hope you enjoyed painting with me. And next week we'll be painting reflections from a photograph I took at Colliery Dam. So I'll see you next week. Thanks for joining me.